The Russian radar gap that turned into a Ukrainian highway. It sounds like a contradiction, a tactical impossibility. How does a nation with one of the most dense and sophisticated air defense networks in the world simply blink? How does a multi-billion-dollar shield, designed over decades to repel the entire might of NATO, develop a fatal crack? This is not a story of a single battle, but of a meticulously planned and audacious strategic operation. It is the story of a 70-kilometer corridor of death carved through the very heart of Russian air defenses on the morning of September 10, 2022. In the fields of the Kharkiv Oblast, a storm was gathering, a storm the Russian high command refused to see coming. This is the story of Operation Kharkiv counteroffensive, and the moment Ukrainian forces exploited a fatal blind spot to achieve one of the most staggering victories of the 21st century.
To understand the gap, one must first understand the wall. Following the initial invasion in February 2022, Russian forces had solidified their hold on much of Ukraine's northeastern Kharkiv region. Their defensive lines were not just trenches and fortifications, they were a deeply layered, integrated air defense system. This network was a complex web of components, long-range S-300 and S-400 Triumph missile systems capable of engaging targets over 400 kilometers away, medium-range Buk M1 systems, and a plethora of short-range Tor M1 and Panzer S-1 systems designed to create an impenetrable umbrella over frontline troops.
The Ukrainian Defender. Opposing this technological titan was the 92nd Separate Mechanized Brigade, a veteran Ukrainian unit bloodied in the early battles of the war, alongside elements of the 25th Separate Airborne Siechislav Brigade and the 80th Separate Air Assault Brigade. The strategic situation by early September was dire. The war had settled into a brutal artillery duel in the south, a grinding war of attrition. But Ukrainian General Valery Zaluzhny and his command staff saw a critical vulnerability. Russian military doctrine, rigid and hierarchical, had created a dangerous dependency. Their entire air defense network in the north was funneled through a handful of key command, control, and communication nodes, C3 hubs. Destroy one critical hub, and a chain reaction of blindness would follow. The main characters of this drama were not just the infantrymen who would charge into the breach, but the planners in Kyiv and the pilots of Ukraine's aging but valiant air force. They identified a critical weakness. The Russian First Guard tank army, tasked with holding the Kharkiv front, had overextended. Its best units had been redeployed south to counter the looming offensive in Kherson. The forces left behind were a mix of Rosgvardia National Guard troops, mobilized separatists from the so-called Luhansk People's Republic, and understrength regular army units. Their morale was low, their equipment patchy, and their air defense coverage, while formidable on paper, was full of holes. The Ukrainians were about to drive a spear through the largest one.
The plan, codenamed Operacja Dzierżawna, Operation Sovereign, was a masterpiece of deception. In the weeks leading up to the offensive, Ukrainian forces in the south began a very public, very noisy preparation for a major crossing of the Dnipro River near Kherson. Social media was flooded with hints, news reports speculated openly, and Ukrainian units made obvious movements. The Russians took the bait, shifting their premier airborne units, their best artillery, and their most potent air defense assets southward. They were convinced the main blow would fall there.
Meanwhile, in the dense forests north of Kharkiv, a phantom army was assembling. Under the cover of darkness and strict radio silence, Ukrainian brigades conducted a masterful, masked deployment. They moved not in large convoys, but in small groups, along secondary roads and through fields. Vehicles were hidden under elaborate nets and foliage during the day.
Every transmission was a risk, every headlight a potential catastrophe. The men of the 92nd Mechanized knew a monumental effort was underway, but the ultimate objective was a closely guarded secret. Fear and anticipation gripped them in equal measure. They could feel the tectonic plates of the war shifting around them.
The Russian radar gap was not an empty space on a map. It was a critical degradation of coverage caused by two factors. First, the physical destruction and electronic suppression of key radar sites by Ukrainian Special Operations Forces and long-range drones in the days prior.
Second, and more critically, was the crippling of the C3 node near the town of Vovchansk. This site was the linchpin, processing data from dozens of smaller radars and coordinating the response of the long-range S-300 and S-400 batteries. Without it, the system became a collection of disjointed, uncoordinated parts.
By 2300 hours on September 9th, the final pieces were in place. Ukrainian artillery, including newly arrived HIMARS systems, had been pre-positioned. Their targets were not just frontline positions, but the deep command posts and logistical hubs of the Russian 20th Combined Arms Army.
The weather was turning. A low, overcast cloud ceiling would further complicate the already degraded Russian air defense picture.
At 0430 hours on September 10th, a deafening roar shattered the pre-dawn calm. The initial artillery barrage was not merely suppression, it was annihilation. Hundreds of shells rained down on known Russian positions, command posts, and, most importantly, the remaining functional air defense assets. Then came the moment of truth. As the sun began to illuminate the smoky horizon, the thrum of turboprop engines echoed from the west. Against all odds and against all modern air defense doctrine, Ukraine's fleet of Soviet-era Su-25 Grach, Rook, ground attack aircraft appeared.
Flying perilously low, sometimes just 50 feet above the treetops, they used the terrain and the Russian confusion to their absolute advantage. The Russian radars, blinded by the loss of their central node and swamped with electronic interference, could not establish a firm lock. The long-range missiles were useless against targets they couldn't see.
Meanwhile, in the dense forests north of Kharkiv, a phantom army was assembling. Under the cover of darkness and strict radio silence, Ukrainian brigades conducted a masterful, masked deployment. They moved not in large convoys, but in small groups, along secondary roads and through fields. Vehicles were hidden under elaborate nets and foliage during the day.
By 0800 hours, the highway was open. The initial infantry assaults, led by special forces groups, punched through the first line of Russian trenches, which were in a state of chaos and disarray.
The defenders, many of whom were asleep when the barrage began, were isolated, their communications jammed, their officers killed in the opening salvos. They had no air support, and their calls for artillery were met with silence. The counter-battery fire had been devastatingly effective.
The gap was no longer theoretical. It was a physical reality. A corridor of air superiority roughly 70 kilometers wide, and Ukrainian mechanized units were now pouring through it.
For the Russian commanders in the rear, the situation was descending into pure chaos. Conflicting reports flooded their headquarters. Some spoke of a massive Ukrainian breakthrough. Others insisted it was just a large-scale raid. The rigid command structure, which demanded permission from higher-ups for any significant movement, became a fatal trap. Requests to redeploy reserves from other sectors were delayed or denied. The chain of command was frozen in disbelief.
On the ground, the reality was apocalyptic for the Russian defenders. Ukrainian T-64 and T-72 tanks, now operating with near impunity from the air, led the charge. BMP-2 infantry fighting vehicles followed, their 30mm cannons chewing apart any resistance. The speed of the advance was breathtaking.
Villages like Balaklia, which the Russians had spent months fortifying, were bypassed and isolated. Ukrainian troops moved not with cautious probing attacks, but with the relentless momentum of a force that knew it had shattered the enemy's will.
The highway became a scene of both triumph and terror. For the advancing Ukrainians, it was a surge of adrenaline and vindication. They saw the evidence of their own effectiveness everywhere: abandoned Russian positions, burning T-72 tanks, and columns of dazed, surrendering soldiers.
But the fear was ever present. Every tree line could hide a Russian anti-tank team. Every moment, they expected the sky to darken with incoming missiles or the roar of Russian aircraft that never came. They were driving deep into the lion's den, and the door behind them was still open.
One concentrated counterattack by a competent Russian reserve unit could sever their supply lines and trap the entire spearhead.
The crisis for Russia was now absolute. By the afternoon of September 11th, the entire northern sector of the front was collapsing. The vital logistical hubs of Kupiansk and Izium were threatened. These were not just towns. They were the lifeline for thousands of Russian troops to the south. If they fell, entire divisions would be encircled. Panic set in. Stories began to emerge of Russian soldiers commandeering civilian cars, shedding their uniforms, and fleeing eastward in a desperate bid to escape the closing trap. The mighty 1st Guards Tank Army, a formation that had rolled into Berlin in 1945, was in a full-scale, disorganized rout. The impossible was happening. A multi-billion-dollar defensive system had not just been cracked, it had been completely bypassed and was now imploding from within. The turning point was not a single dramatic cavalry charge, but the relentless exploitation of a shattered system. The heroic decision had been made weeks before in a command bunker in Kiev. The decision to believe their intelligence, to trust in their plan, and to commit their strategic reserve to a single decisive blow. Now on the ground, that decision was being executed with breathtaking speed and courage. Ukrainian commanders, empowered by a culture of mission-type tactics, did not wait for orders. Battalion and company-level leaders saw opportunities and seized them. While the Russian system was paralyzed, the Ukrainian system was agile and adaptive. When a bridge was destroyed, engineers worked under fire to erect a crossing. When a strong point held out, it was bypassed, leaving follow-on forces to mop up the resistance. This was blitzkrieg in reverse, executed not by the presumed master of the art, but by the student who had learned its lessons all too well. The key was the continued neutralization of the Russian air defense network. Ukrainian Su-25s and Bayraktar TB2 drones, which had been largely absent from the skies for months due to improved Russian electronic warfare, now operated with a new lease on life. They became the eyes and the artillery spotters for the advancing columns. They hunted the remaining Russian artillery pieces and identified fleeing convoys for destruction. The radar gap was not a momentary lapse. It was a persistent condition, expertly maintained by a combination of electronic warfare, drone surveillance, and the sheer speed of the ground offensive that overran the repositioning sites for mobile Russian air defense units. The final, symbolic turning point came with the liberation of the city of Balaklia on September 8th, and then the strategic prize of Kupiansk, a critical railway junction, on September 10th. Ukrainian soldiers, riding on top of their BMPs, were met not with gunfire, but with weeping, cheering civilians who had endured 6 months of brutal occupation. The images of the Ukrainian flag being raised over the Kupiansk city administration building were broadcast around the world. They were more than just propaganda. They were proof that the Russian army was not 10 feet tall. It could be beaten. It was being beaten. In just 5 days, Ukrainian forces had advanced over 70 kilometers, a rate of advance not seen since World War II. The highway had reached its destination, and it had torn a hole in the map of occupied Ukraine. The outcome of the operation was a strategic catastrophe for Russia and the single greatest Ukrainian victory of the war to that date. In a lightning-fast campaign, Ukrainian forces liberated over 12,000 square kilometers of territory, an area larger than the entirety of Lebanon. The Russian 20th Combined Arms Army was mauled, losing an estimated 500 tanks and armored vehicles and suffering thousands of casualties, with many more taken as prisoners of war. The Russians abandoned vast stockpiles of ammunition, intact equipment, and highly sensitive documents in their headlong flight from Izium. The human cost, however, was steep. While Ukrainian casualties were light compared to the Russian debacle, the victory was paid for with the blood of its most courageous soldiers and pilots, the ones who had led the assault into the unknown against what should have been impossible odds. Their names are etched into the memory of a nation. The legacy of the Kharkiv counteroffensive is profound. It shattered the myth of Russian military invincibility and proved that will,
ingenuity, and courage could overcome mass and firepower. It changed the entire strategic calculus of the war, forcing a humiliated Russian high command into a partial mobilization and the abandonment of its ambitions in the north.
For his masterful planning and execution, General Valery Zaluzhny was hailed as a national hero. Countless soldiers of the 92nd Mechanized, 25th Airborne, and 80th Air Assault Brigades were decorated for their bravery, their actions recognized with the highest state honors.
The Russian radar gap that turned into a Ukrainian highway became a case study in modern warfare, a testament to the fact that the most formidable fortifications can be rendered useless if the mind of the defender can be outmaneuvered.
This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to WWII-Records as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.